Welcome to Chasm Chills. If you enjoy horror stories, subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. Let's explore the unknown together. Emily moved to this city and apartment as a desperate attempt to escape the traumas of her past. Her relationship with her mother had been marked by unresolved conflicts, culminating in her sudden death, laden with regrets and unspoken words. The pain of this loss seemed to be the central reason for her flight, and the new city offered her a chance to hide from the ghosts that haunted her. The apartment, with its decrepit and gloomy air, symbolized Emily's emotional state, an isolated refuge, ideal for someone who wanted to avoid not only contact with others, but also confrontation with her own feelings. The cracks in the walls and the oppressive environment mirrored the fragile and worn state she was in. Every detail of the new dwelling seemed in tune with her need for isolation, even if it meant greater introspection and eventually facing what she was trying so hard to avoid. The wooden door creaked as it closed, a sound that mingled with the heavy silence of the place. Emily began to explore the apartment, noting the yellowed ceiling and the worn walls. There was no luxury, only a simple and somber environment, suitable for someone seeking to escape from memories and grief. The narrow hallway and low ceiling created a sense of confinement, but she decided to ignore the discomfort. After all, it was only a temporary place. She believed she would get used to it in time. That first night, exhaustion overcame her. Exhausted from the memories and confused by the tumultuous thoughts, Emily fell asleep quickly. However, around 3 a.m, something disturbing woke her. The apartment was shrouded in darkness, but a strange sound unsettled her. She lay in silence, trying to identify the source of the noise. It seemed distant and almost imperceptible, like an ethereal whisper. It could have been the plumbing or the wind passing through the cracks. Trying not to let her unease take over, Emily closed her eyes again, determined to ignore the disturbance. However, as the sound persisted, her unease grew. It didn't seem like something typical for an old house. It was low and constant, with a peculiar cadence that suggested words. Emily sat up in bed, trying to focus, but as she tried to concentrate, the sound disappeared, leaving only the oppressive silence that filled the space. "It's just my imagination," she murmured to herself. The old building seemed to be playing tricks on her thoughts, and her tired, overwhelmed mind was reacting. Trying to convince herself it was just a coincidence, she lay back down, determined to ignore the disturbance. But the feeling that something was wrong didn't leave her. The following days passed strangely, with Emily trying to adjust to her new routine. Remote work kept her busy during the day, but the nights were always a challenge. The silence of the apartment, which had once seemed merely uncomfortable, now felt intentional. It was as if the very space around her was watching her, waiting for something. On the second night, the whispers returned. This time, they were more persistent. Emily was in the living room, trying to distract herself with a book. But the sounds seemed to be getting closer, as if someone was speaking behind the walls. She put the book down on the couch and stood up, alert. The sound was coming from the walls of the hallway. Slowly she approached, her heart racing. When she pressed her ear to the wall, she felt a shiver run down her spine. It wasn't the wind or the plumbing. It was voices, faint and indistinct, but clearly human. However, she couldn't make out what they were saying. It was like listening to a conversation through a barrier, something just on the edge of comprehension. It must be someone in the apartment next door, she thought. But as she stepped away from the wall and returned to the living room, the sounds continued. They followed her. The words, still incomprehensible, grew closer, almost as if they were whispering directly in her ears. Emily felt a tightness in her throat from anxiety. She tried to ignore it. Maybe it was accumulated stress. Maybe she was imagining things. She remembered stories she had read about auditory hallucinations in lonely or disturbed people. But no matter how hard she tried, the disturbance deepened. That night, sleep was scarce. She tossed and turned in bed, tormented by the whispers that wouldn't let her rest. It was as if there was someone, or something there, in the darkness of the apartment, speaking to her. Every time she closed her eyes, it felt like she heard words closer, as if the voices were calling her name, always on the verge of being understood but never completely clear. As the days went by, the voices became a constant presence, always there, in the background, whispering through the apartment walls. Emily tried to ignore them, tried to focus on work, but it was useless. The voices seemed closer with every moment of silence. One night, as she prepared to sleep, the whispers changed. Instead of being mere incomprehensible noises, the words began to take shape. At first, they were disjointed phrases, brief but clear. And what she heard made her heart stop for a moment. "You were never good enough." Emily was paralyzed. It was her mother's voice, a familiar, critical, and cold tone. For a moment, she believed she was dreaming or that her mind was playing tricks on her. But the words continued. "You always failed me." The words were the same ones she had heard repeatedly throughout her childhood and adolescence, spoken by her mother during the countless arguments they had. Emily tried to push away the thought that it was something supernatural. Maybe her mind was crumbling under the weight of guilt and grief, projecting her mother's words onto the apartment walls. But the voices persisted, night after night. The phrases became more specific, more personal. They spoke of things Emily had never told anyone, intimate details of her life. They commented on the burdens she carried, her inability to forgive, the loneliness she felt, the regret of never reconciling with her mother before her death. Every time Emily heard the voices, the weight of grief became more unbearable. The apartment was no longer just a refuge. It had become a place of confrontation, where her fears and guilt were brought to the surface, a disturbing whisper of every mistake she tried to forget. Disturbed by the increasingly present voices, Emily decided she needed to understand what was happening. If it wasn't a product of her mind, then there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps the previous tenants had left some clue, something that could explain the feeling that the apartment was alive, draining her energy. It was during one of these afternoons of investigation that she decided to speak with the building's superintendent, an elderly man who seemed to know everything that went on around there. When she mentioned the apartment where she lived, he hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words before responding. "Did you know that the last tenant of your apartment died?" he asked, with a distant look. Emily froze, feeling a chill run down her spine. "I don't think I was told anything about that." The superintendent let out a heavy sigh, scratching his head before continuing. She was disturbed. She kept saying she heard voices, that the walls talked to her. He laughed nervously, but there was a bitter edge to his tone. "Some people thought she was crazy. She ended up dying alone in there. No one found out until days later." Emily left, feeling sick to her stomach. Back in the apartment, she sat on the couch, trying to process the information, hearing voices just like her. It was too sinister a coincidence to ignore. But what else could explain what was happening? Was the apartment repeating the same pattern with her? While rummaging through some old cabinets, Emily found something that made her shiver, a small box of letters and notes. left by the previous tenant. Among the pages, desperate scrawls told the story of a woman on the brink of madness, tormented by the same voices. She wrote about the walls as if they had a life of their own, knowing her thoughts, her guilt. They know everything about me, my secrets, my sins. The previous tenant's words mirrored exactly what Emily was experiencing. The voices, the feeling of being pursued, the weight of guilt being amplified. The line between reality and madness began to blur. And Emily realized she was trapped in something much larger than a mere hallucination. The following nights were unbearable. The voices that had once whispered in the walls now echoed throughout the apartment, invading every corner of Emily's mind. Silence seemed like a distant thing, almost a memory. The words, once vague, were now sharp and cruel. You always ran away from everything. You never apologized. She died not knowing that you loved her. The phrases intertwined with memories of her mother, the arguments, the unresolved hurts. Emily paced back and forth, exhausted but unable to sleep. The apartment seemed to close in around her. The narrow walls, the cracks, everything contributed to an oppressive sense of confinement. In a moment of despair, she screamed, unable to bear the weight of guilt suffocating her. "Stop! I understand already. Stop!" But the voices didn't stop. On the contrary, they grew louder, more intense, as if reacting to her pain, feeding off it. The house seemed alive, pulsating with every emotion she tried to suppress. Emily closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. Exhaustion consumed her, but there was nowhere to escape. It was then she realized, no matter what she did, the voices were inside her. They weren't ghosts or malevolent spirits. They were her own guilt, her deepest fears taking shape in the apartment's walls. The echo of mistakes she had never resolved. She sat on the living room floor, hugging her knees, rocking gently as if trying to comfort herself. It was all true. She had failed her mother. She never had the courage to apologize, to fix the relationship. And now, her mother was dead, taking with her the chance for forgiveness. Regret gnawed at every thought, and the voices were just a reflection of that. The words echoed in her mind over and over. You let her down. Always let her down. Emily tried to block out the thoughts, but they came from all sides. There was no place to run, no place to hide. The apartment had become an emotional prison where every wall reflected the pain of her soul. She closed her eyes, pressing her hands against her ears, as if that could push away the sound. But in the darkness of her mind, the voices continued. It was as if the entire apartment was witnessing her collapse, feeding on it. Finally, in one last act of desperation, Emily stood up and shouted again, "What do you want from me?" The voices suddenly stopped. The silence, heavy and dense, filled the air. The entire apartment stood still as if waiting. Emily took a deep breath, trying to regain control. She knew then that the voices wanted one thing. She needed to confront her own ghosts. She needed to face the guilt she had been avoiding for so long. Emily stood in the middle of the living room, the echo of silence now more deafening than the voices. For the first time in days, the walls were not whispering. There was a stillness, but it was not reassuring. It was the kind of silence that precedes a dark revelation. The sense that something was about to happen grew inside her. The last words of the voices still echoed in her mind. You let her down. Everything was coming together. The voices weren't external entities, weren't ghosts from the past. They were reflections of everything she had never had the courage to face. The painful truth was in front of her. The apartment was amplifying her guilt, her grief, and her inability to deal with her mother's death. She remembered the letters from the previous tenant, they know everything about me, my secrets, my sins. The words now made sense. The apartment, somehow, had the power to awaken the deepest guilt, exposing secrets even its occupants were not ready to confront. Perhaps for that woman, the confrontation had been too much. She succumbed to the pressure and madness. Emily, on the other hand, felt herself on the brink of the same precipice. The line between sanity and collapse had never been so thin. She looked around the apartment, breathing heavily, her body still trembling with adrenaline. She could see the same fate repeating, and she knew that if she stayed there, the voices would come back. But this time, she had no doubts. She needed to leave. She needed to leave the apartment and all the memories it evoked. The voices were part of her, yes, but the apartment was the catalyst that amplified them to the breaking point. Without wasting time, Emily began to pack her things. With every step, she felt the weight of the place slightly lifting. But even as she stuffed her clothes into her suitcase and looked at the door to the exit, she couldn't shake the fear that wherever she went, these voices, these truths, would follow her. She was ready to leave. But the question consuming her now was, what would happen next? The apartment could be left behind, but the guilt that had always been inside her. Emily left the apartment with a mix of relief and anguish. The new city was quiet, and the early morning chill made her thoughts seem even darker. She walked to a nearby 24-hour cafe and settled at a table by the window, where the warm light and the aroma of coffee were a small comfort. As she took a sip of her coffee, Emily felt a blend of comfort and unease. The apartment had been a cruel mirror of her fears and guilt, but she realized that the real battle was not just escaping that place, but confronting what it had revealed about herself. The grief over her mother's death and the guilt she felt were emotions she needed to face head-on, not simply leave behind. Determined to confront the past, Emily decided she needed to visit the cemetery where her mother was buried. The journey there felt endless, but she knew it was necessary to find some semblance of peace. When she arrived at the grave, she sat on the ground, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said, her voice choked. "I was running from myself. I didn't know how to handle all of this." As she spoke, she felt a weight being lifted from her shoulders. With tears still streaming down her face, Emily realized that to move forward, she needed to confront her pain and accept that while the past couldn't be changed, she could transform her life now. With a newfound sense of clarity, Emily stood up and decided to seek a new direction, a future where she could use her experiences to help others and reconnect with what truly mattered. The apartment and its shadows were left behind, but the transformation she sought was just beginning.